today we're working on construction methods. So we're going to go over how to build your basic flat and your basic platform. This is all going to be really useful for that final project for all of you. So we are going to use the methods that they use in your Stagecraft handbook. So you should have already read over a lot of this, and it should all kind of be, how do I phrase this? It should ring a bell as we're talking about it. So before I go into the shop, I'm just going to go over what we're going to be doing. We are going to make our corner blocks, as you can see there. We're going to use keystones. There are different methods of building keystones. Don't worry too much about that. It won't impact how you do what you're going to be doing for your project. And we are going to create the basic framing structure, the support, and our diagonal braces. So I have everything put out. They've got a name for every single one. They've got stiles and rails. That's not going to ultimately be important. Most of the time you're going to hear people refer to it as framing, and that's just a more common way to phrase it. There might be people who are sticklers to these terms, but it's more you need to know toggle, corner blocks, and keystones. Those are the ones that people are more sticklers about. But so you can see they've measured out where the cross braces are supposed to hit, the size of their flat, and then they've made a cut list, and that's what these pictures are over here. And normally you would make this cut list and it would indicate the size of the pieces that you're going to be using. Then you can see we're going to adhere it in a very similar pattern, if not exactly this pattern. Sometimes you run into knots in your wood and things like that, and you've got to vary it up, but you have a pretty good idea of how it'll work. Also, these are the standard sizes for the type of flat that they were building. I believe it was like a 10 by 4. Yeah, 10 by 4. I'm going to be building a baby flat, or a 1 foot by 6 inch flat, just something small so you can see how it works, but something that's not going to use up too much of our resources. So yeah, that is what you need to know about flats. Before I this is a really good page to look over to think about how that's working. The reason that they put in this gap, they will show you right here. It's so when you join them together, there's room enough for you to have a flush surface. So an important thing to know. And one more thing before we move on from flats. When we are building the ones for your project, you're going to need to look at this page. It is page 126 in the Stagecraft handbook. This shows you how you structure things if you've got an opening. In this case, there's a window there. That looks like a door flat. That's a door flat with the door in the center. It shows you how you're going to need to change the make of what you're doing. And I will expect this from you on your final project. If you have questions about it, of course, ask me. But otherwise, you don't get to just produce a bunch of flats and then cut a hole in it. You need to support it in your framing. Because if you were just to cut a hole in something like this, you would have something that would collapse. So we're going to be learning proper methods. Now, let's go ahead and move on to platforms. Okay, so where it starts talking about platforms is going to be on page 153. So on page 153, it shows you the basic framing of the most standard platform of 4x8. It shows you where you need to add bracing in for support, and it also shows you how we create the frame with a 3 fastener attachment on either end. There's also it depends on what you need your platform to do, but more often than not, you're going to use the long piece. You're going to have that be the full length, the 8-foot length, or the longest part of it, and then the 4-foot will actually be taken in. So in most cases, you're going to see people using 2x4. So you need to account for that 2x4. What is, once again, we've talked about this before, what is a 2x4 actually in width? It is 3.5 by 1.5. So we're going to have to take off a total of 3 inches on each of these braces where they meet, so that the total width with the additional 1.5 inch here and 1.5 inch here will equal an even 4 feet. So I will show you all of that once again once we get into the scene shop. Obviously, once again, I'm going to make a little baby platform. I'm not going to make a huge one. I think it's probably going to be 1.5 feet by 9 inches or something like that. So it's going to be a little bit bigger, but still pretty small, because we don't really need to use a ton of resources for you to get the gist of how this will work. The next thing you need to know is about what we put on top. So on page 154, most of the time you're going to use something like plywood. It might not be exactly plywood. Some people use different types of plywood. That's got some variance in it. It isn't always CDX plywood, but it's going to be a hard material that's tough, but it has some flexibility in it so that when the platform is shifting, it can manage that. Then we're not going to do this today, and we're not going to do it for your project. But a lot of time what people will do is they will put a layer of Homosote on. That's that sort of squishy, papery material that we talked about in class. Unfortunately, you guys aren't going to have a tight grasp on what that means because you never got a chance to actually see and touch it in person. But the point of it is to be essentially a soundproofing layer. It's there so that you don't hear every squeak every time someone steps on a platform. And then they're going to have the masonite layer, which will create a nice smooth layer that we can paint or treat however we need to. Once again, we're just going to do that plywood topper. And a lot of times the platforms that you will see in terms of stock platforms in the scene shop are going to be that because we can always put more things on top. But you need to have the completed platform have this this top layer because it's what keeps the framing from flexing. So you keep them all together and it keeps everything strong so that the next time you use it, you've still got a solid platform. All right, so now that you guys have the gist of it, I'm going to go into the scene shop next and I'm going to go ahead and build these. I apologize if the video isn't the highest quality. I got a new camera and it did not want to work. It's got extreme audio delay. So right now I'm just filming these on my cell phone. So I apologize for the shaky quality. I apologize for the fact that they're not the best quality, but I'm hoping that they will, for the most part, do the job. All right. All right, we're in the shop. So what we're doing right now is we're going to go ahead and we're going to measure out our pieces here for our flat. So of course you need to have some form of measurement. For us it's going to be our handy dandy measuring tape and something to mark with, a pencil, yay! Okay, so I want to make this a 1 foot flat by 6 inches. So I'm going to mark my line here. My 2 longest pieces are going to be cut. And I'm going to mark from the other side because this piece is long enough to get those 2 1 foot pieces out of one. All right, then we're going to extend those lines. So I'll be right back. So to make sure that I've got a straight line, I'm going to use a tool that we've talked about in class called a speed square, sometimes called a framing square, but it's not one that we've definitely talked about. The nice part about it is it's got this flat edge that will catch on our piece of lumber, and we'll be able to know that the line that we're drawing is going to be square. So looking at this line right here that I've drawn on, I'm just going to make sure everything lines up. And I've extended my line there, and that way I know that I'm cutting a straight line so long as it falls on there. The other thing that is pretty common practice to do is the center section is the part we're going to be cutting off, and that will be important. So I just tend to put an X, so I know that that piece is going to be the piece that we're going to cut off. So I've decided to change my mind and make our flat 2 feet by 1.5 feet ish. More like 1 foot 5 inches and a quarter and 3/4. Excuse me, 1 foot 5 inches and 3/4. Because I have enough board for it and it'll be a little bit bigger and easier to illustrate. But where did I come up with that 5 3/4? The width of our boards are 2 inches and 7/8. So we've got to account for that when we're measuring everything out, and so that will determine the overall width of what we're putting together. Okay? Okay, so I ended up changing my measurements one more time because I found a staple in the lumber. So our total height of our flat is going to be 22 inches. And our total width is going to be 1 foot 5 3/4 inches. So I am now ready to make those cuts. You know how you can tell I'm ready to make the cuts? Safety goggles on, hearing protection on. So I'll see you over at the saw. Okay, so this is our miter saw, or one of them. As you can see, we've got it set up. It's all plugged in, ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and make my cut. And what I'm going to do before I make that cut is I'm going to find my X. That's right here. So I know that this piece is not going to be the piece that I keep, which means that I'm going to put my blade on that side of the line. The blade is going to be 1/16 of an inch cut off. And so you want to make sure that that part is not on your cut, because that eventually will build up in your framing not being the correct size. 1/16 here, another there, and suddenly you're off by 1/4 of an inch. And that can be the difference between your set lining up and looking nice and being a total mess. So I'm going to find my line. So I'm going to show you guys what I mean before I turn the saw on. So you can, before you engage the saw, you can bring the blade down onto your wood and you can see where it's going to hit. Right now it's off by too much. So I'm going to adjust. I'm going to move my board slightly more to the right. Let's see how it lines up there. That's pretty close. I would say that that would be a good cut. So I'm going to go ahead and make that cut. Put you guys over here. This is going to be loud. Maybe turn down your volume for a minute. Okay, so I hope you noticed 2 things. One, I had my hand here to support the board. I had it pressed up against this plate so that it was not moving anywhere. And I used my other hand to engage the saw here. Once again, this is going to get loud. I'm going to show you when you push this button here, that's when you get power to your saw. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and cut the rest of the pieces that we need and we'll get on to the next step. So we have the basics of our frame. You'll note that this piece is a little bit thinner than these pieces are. Realistically, for a frame for a flat this small, we probably wouldn't need this center brace. So I just used what we had in stock because I wanted you to get a sense of what we would need our keystones for. So right now, our next step, once we've got everything pretty well flush, get it all lined up the way we like it, we're going to make sure we've got this brace in the center of our top and bottom here to help support the overall structure. So the way that I like to find this usually is by measuring my original board and finding the center of that board. For this, that would be 11 inches. So we'll go ahead and put a mark there and a mark there, and we'll do the same over here. And then I'm going to find the center of the board itself, and we'll be able to line those lines up, and we'll know that we're pretty close, if not right on, being the center. So this board is 2 inches and a quarter. So let's go ahead and mark off 1 1/8 right there. Oh, I suppose that's out of your view. I apologize. 1 1/8. It's going to be right there. We'll mark that on both ends. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and we'll extend all these lines out so they're crystal clear and we're not doing any guesswork. Okay, so as you can see, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that those line up. And that sets us up for the next step in our process, which is making sure that everything is square. Well, once again, this handy dandy speed square is going to come into play. Now here's the one problem, is our speed square is a little bit bigger than what our center brace is. So I'm going to take that out for the time being, and we're going to make sure that the base of our frame is square first, and we'll get this all assembled, and then we'll add in that center brace. Alright team, the next thing that we're going to need is some wood glue. We're going to need our air compressor and our pneumatic stapler. Reminder, pneumatic refers to something that is powered by air pressure. And we're going to be using these short staples as our fasteners. There are different fasteners that you can use depending on the situation, but given how small a piece we're making and the type of material we're going to be using, this will work just fine. Then I have made some little toggles, or excuse me, keystones and corner blocks. So we're going to put this all together. And you'll get the gist of what we're trying to do. Alright, so one thing to remember is the glue is where we're getting the strength of our frame from. So we're going to we're going to glue onto our frame, and we're going to put them next to each other like this, so that we've got that glue holding there. We're going to take our framing square, or speed square here, and we're going to make sure that we've got everything square, looking pretty good. And then we're going to take our corner block, boom, and we're going to hit that with some glue as well. Now, one of the things that this won't really impact probably too much of what you're doing, but will impact if you are working on a real flat, is you want to be conscious of the amount of glue you put on. You don't want enough on there that it's going to slip and slide around. You're going to have to deal with that, but you want enough on there that it's going to provide some strength. So I'm going to put this on here, move that out now that we know that we have got it square. Now normally what I would do is I would make sure I've got the same distance around each edge in case we were going to have a flat line up like we talked about before we came out here. But for the sake of moving through this fairly quickly, we're not going to deal with that because it won't make a difference for our tiny little baby flat. So I'll get it lined up where I want it. Once again, this is going to get loud. You might want to consider turning down the volume. I'll give you a 3 count. That's going to be 1, 2, 3. There we go. And there you have it. It's together. So as you can see, we have the basis of our frame. We've got a little bit of a gap here, but that's because the lumber is a little bit more warped than I saw. That's an important thing to look out for. Normally, if I came across that issue, I would back up, cut a new piece, take all of this apart. But for the sake of this should be fine. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get some glue on each of the ends for this and put this guy in where he belongs. Okay, so we'll get this guy lined up. And this one also has some warping to it. And also normally your toggles would not extend beyond your board. So keep that in mind. Take a look at the examples you have in your book. This is just to show you how you would put it together, not necessarily the perfect scenario. The perfect scenario is pretty well illustrated in your book. So we'll get some glue on our keystone here. Okay, once again, this is about to get loud. Okay. Okay. Whoop. Put that on there. Okay. So this is the basis for our frame. Now, what I want you to recognize is we're going to let this glue sit, but normally what would, when you got done, you would either face it with, either you could use some plywood, some masonite, some Luan, or you could do a soft flat or a Broadway flat, in which case it would have muslin stretched over the top. So everyone's going to be a little bit different depending on the needs of your show. And yeah, that's basics on how to build a frame. So I was going to build a platform for you guys, and then I realized that I wasn't going to be able to do it very well one-handed or with the setup that I had. So I thought I'd show you the platforms that we have and explain to you how they were made and what how they would be put together. So it's pretty straightforward, very much similar to building out the frame for your flats. You're still going to want a square joining point. You're going to want everything to line up and be flush. The difference would be that you're going to typically use screws as your fasteners, because then they can feed into the next piece of lumber that you have. So they can feed from here to here. You're still going to have cross bracing, or excuse me, not cross bracing. You're still going to have bracing. I'm not sure why I said cross bracing. You're still going to have to measure everything out, make sure that everything is square and lined up. But once again, like I said, you're going to have those screws leading into your next piece of lumber. Now, these are a little bit different, as you can see, from the ones that we would normally make based on the Stagecraft handbook. The difference in how they were built ultimately comes down to a technique that some people use, where they use kind coffin locks. I don't know why I couldn't think of the name of that for a second. Where they use coffin locks as a way to attach one to another. When you turn them correctly, a piece, they will be able to join where they meet up. Let's see. So this right here would be turned with an Allen wrench, and this piece would connect in to the open piece on another platform. So because of that, they've moved the top, or they've moved the frame of the platform away from the edge of the top. Normally the way we make it, and the way you will make it for your project, is to have the frame go to the edge of your sheet good. Sheet goods refer to anything that is wider than it is thick. That's going to be a sheet good. Luan Reminder is a sheet good. Homostote's a sheet good. Masonite's a sheet good. Plywood is a sheet good. So when you're making your platforms for your model, this is not going to be the example that you will use. Use the example in the book and build your frame out to the width and length of your platform. Okay, I'm going to show you some of the most basic techniques that we use in scenic painting. And that isn't to say that they're necessarily simple, because for some people it takes a long time to pick up and get the handle on it. And it doesn't mean that they are not useful. In fact, that when I say basics, I mean that these are the core paint techniques that you will have scenic artists go back to time and time again. So the first one is just a simple scumble. And a scumble is kind of a fancy way of saying blend, but it's an intentional blend with a specific outcome. So my goal is not to have one blended color. It's more of an ombre. A lot of times you want your scumble to be patchy. You want some of that dark to be heavier in one spot, and you want some of the light to be heavier in another spot. And sometimes you want a blend of the two colors to make a third color. A scumble is something that we vary how we use it all the time. We change up what we need from it all of the time, and that's what makes it so useful, and that's why it's something that we come back to. Most of the time when doing a scumble, you're going to see people doing these X cross hatches. And the reason for that is the goal is to not see that. It's kind of hard to see with the shine. Let me grab, we don't want to see that. We don't want to see a horrible clear streak that just can be seen from space. We want something that's going to blend nicely so that there's a little bit of texture on stage that helps the audience see the scenery as something other than flat, which of course it is. Scenic painters by nature are liars. Okay, I'm going to show you some of the most basic techniques that we use in scenic painting. And that isn't to say that they're necessarily simple, because for some people it takes a long time to pick up and get the handle on it. And it doesn't mean that they are not useful. In fact, that when I say basics, I mean that these are the core paint techniques that you will have scenic artists go back to time and time again. So the first one is just a simple scumble. And a scumble is kind of a fancy way of saying blend, but it's an intentional blend with a specific outcome. So my goal is not to have one blended color. It's more of an ombre. A lot of times you want your scumble to be patchy. You want some of that dark to be heavier in one spot, and you want some of the light to be heavier in another spot. And sometimes you want a blend of the two colors to make a third color. A scumble is something that we vary how we use it all the time. We change up what we need from it all of the time, and that's what makes it so useful, and that's why it's something that we come back to. Most of the time, when doing a scumble, you're going to see people doing these X crosshatches. And the reason for that is the goal is to not see that. It's kind of hard to see with the shine. Let me grab... We don't want to see that. We don't want to see a horrible, clear streak that just can be seen from space. We want something that's going to blend nicely so that there's a little bit of texture on stage that helps the audience see the scenery as something other than flat, which of course it is. Scenic painters by nature are liars. Next technique I'm going to show you is very, very simple, and yet so many people can find themselves in a pickle when doing it. This is called a spatter. Basically, you're going to have some wet, watery paint on your brush that you are going, and then you're going to flick the brush to create a spatter of paint. This is a great way to add texture. It's a great way to water down a treatment you already have so it's not so harsh. You can go back over it with both of the colors. Another way to make our very flat surface look not so flat. Next, I'm going to show you sponging. Now, sponging typically means taking a sea sponge with some paint on it and applying that texture all over the surface that you are looking for. You might want a couple of different colors, much like your scumble, so that you get more dimension in there. You might want to vary your shape and turn it lots of different ways so that you don't get the exact same pattern repeating over and over again. But sponging is something we use all of the time. Okay, so next we're going to do a wash. Washes, once again, you're going to have some watery paint on your brush, and you're going to treat it like you're basting a turkey. You want a little bit all over the entire surface. Not basting a turkey. Yes? No. It's not important. The point is you're using a watery paint to change the surface, but not completely. Is it completely pink now? No. Is it completely black now? No. But it is something different, and it is a different texture.